Hello, everyone. This is Michael Tobolsky with WEConnect International. We're excited to have you join us today, and thank you for participating. So before we get started, I'll turn it over to Rachel Williams that's going to go through the logistics.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the call. Some housekeeping notes to let you know. You should be able to see a screen which will provide information about the agenda as well as our panelists who are joining us today. All of you are on listen-only mode throughout the webinar, and what will happen towards the end of the webinar, we will welcome questions either through the question or the chat box, and we will read those questions for the panelists to answer. So therefore, you will all be muted throughout the duration of the webinar, but we very much welcome your questions, as I mentioned, through the chat or questions box, and we will respond to your questions at the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. If you have any issues in the meantime, you can please feel free to email me at rwilliams@weconnectinternational.org if you have any issues throughout the duration of the webinar. But with that, I will turn it over to our moderator for today's panel, Michael Tobolsky.
Thank you, Rachel. And during this webinar, you're going to hear from leading corporate supplier diversity and inclusion professionals and how they have successfully expanded their supplier diversity and inclusion efforts beyond the U.S., utilizing innovative strategies as well as providing best practices. So I'd like to first start with introducing our distinguished panelists. So we have Peter Zerp, who's the Supplier Inclusion Program Lead for Accenture, Javed Hines with Citigroup, Director, Head of Supply Chain Development, Inclusion, and Sustainability. We have Helena Hutton with Cummins, who's the Global Diversity Procurement Leader, and then Lee Lewis from Enterprise Holdings, who's the Global Supplier Diversity Manager. So to get started, I'd like to ask each of you just to share a little bit about your organization and how your company's global supplier diversity and inclusion efforts look like today. So if we could start with Peter.
Sure. So hello, everyone. Well, I guess nice to all meet you. So my name is Peter Zerp. I'm based in, I work for Accenture based in Amsterdam, and one of the drivers of our global supplier inclusion and diversity program. And thanks so much, WEConnect, for this opportunity to share our program with you all. So our program is now, our global program is now 10 years old. We are in 18 countries. We have quite a strong focus on women-owned businesses, but we do cover all the diversity areas. We're one of the co-founders of WEConnect Internationals, and we are collaborating with WEConnect in 16 countries right now. We also have, but I might be sharing more around that later, our Diverse Supply Development Program, which is a great training and development program that we're doing in 4 countries right now, in US, Canada, United Kingdom, and South Africa, where we train diverse businesses that are relevant to Accenture and our clients, and we also help them mentor and grow their business and make the right kind of business connections.
Great, thank you, Peter. Javed, can you tell us a little about Citi, please?
Sure. So again, thanks for having me. Citi has actually had a supplier diversity program for some time, since 1977. We started to focus globally maybe a little bit before 2008, before I arrived, and that was with MSD UK. And then we reinvigorated that dialogue probably around 2015. Rejoining them, but maintaining a relationship with Supply Nation consistently from about 2007 until now. And then we joined WEConnect right around 2016, perhaps. We have a consistent focus on all diverse groups, but we have a very specific focus on women, and particularly in developing countries right now. But currently, we're probably in only about 5 countries. We're a member of WEConnect, MSD UK, joining the South African Supplier Development Council, as well as CAMC and Supply Nation. And we have champions in each of the regions in which we are seeking to be consistently global in our approach. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I know one of the things we're going to talk about is having regional champions, so that's really a key to success. Helena, can you share on Cummins?
Sure, thank you. I'm Helena Hutton with Cummins, and with respect to our program, We've had a program for about more than 40 years in the US and probably the last 15 years globally, 15 to 20 years globally. We're structured where we're part of the purchasing organization, and we have an internal steering committee that essentially guides us and helps us with our global program, which is comprised of some of our key officers, like our president, our general counsel, our corporate services, and that's what helps us really navigate in the US and abroad. With respect to the types of diverse suppliers we look for, we have a range, and it depends on the region what suppliers we're looking for. So, for example, we've even grown in India and Latin America, where we've included LGBT suppliers. But traditionally, it's women-owned businesses that we're most successful at incorporating in our program.
Okay. Thank you, Helena. And Lee Lewis.
Well, good morning, everyone. Michael, thank you for including me on the panel. I appreciate the opportunity to share and to learn. Enterprise Holdings is the parent company for Enterprise Rent-A-Car, Alamo Car Rental, and National Car Rental companies. As such, we have a supplier diversity program that's been in place for about 7 years or so, and we have a footprint, as far as the company is concerned, of about 90 countries. However, our supplier diversity efforts are at about 7 countries now. I've been in this role for the last 4 years and have focused my efforts obviously on the United States, but I'm also active in Canada and Western Europe. This department is housed within supply chain management here at Enterprise, but I tend to be a one-man department where supplier diversity is concerned specifically. There are some other things that I will share with you that talks about how we managed to get that done, but there's sort of the thumbnail sketch of supplier diversity and inclusion at Enterprise.
Thank you, Lee. So one of the things that always comes up is how do we get resources, how do we get support within our organization to go beyond the U.S.? And I think there's a perception that the supplier diversity is just a U.S. effort and it doesn't need to go beyond the borders, but most companies, multinationals, are doing business multiple places and have the majority of the revenue coming from outside of the U.S. So in terms of the panelists, what was the business case within your organization to expand beyond the U.S.? And Javed, if we could start with you.
Sure, Michael. So one of the things that we constantly talk about within Citi is, making sure that we're doing business in all the countries in which we are located. So we have business in about 100. We're in 160 countries. We're doing business in about 96. And while obviously we cannot do business in all 96 in terms of supplier diversity, the key thing for us is that, when we speak of inclusion, that we are consistently focused from a global approach. So the key thing for us was to take a look at diversity across the board, contemplate, organizations that are situated there, particularly working and focused on sustainability and or diversity, but particularly a certification process. And that was kind of the lens that we took in terms of looking at what makes sense for Citi. The other piece for us in considering, going global is where do we actually have brick and mortar and actually people who can truly be accountable from a sourcing perspective. So those are some of the thought processes that went into play when we started thinking about where does it make sense for us to start from a global approach, certainly where we're doing business, but especially where we actually have procurement people who can really pick up the mantle and make it a global program, but based on that region in that country, not a U.S.-centric program.
Thank you, Javed. And Helena, can you share about the business case at Cummins for expansion?
Sure. And when I shared the range of time for our global program, that's because we've had different presence in different countries based on the local needs. So, for example, in South Africa, the need came up because of the government. Essentially, we do business in South Africa, and for us to meet the government requirements for us to sell to the government and different entities in Africa, we have to meet certain government requirements. So for us, compliance has really driven a lot of growth and accountability. I just balance that with, in certain countries, it's also passion. Our employee resource groups are the ones that help to also drive it in different regions. So we're in 190 countries, and it's based on our customer footprint, and where there are opportunities. And so based on those, I'd say the employee resource groups where the employees are passionate and know the value and see it, they help drive it, partnering with purchasing. And then in addition, from the sales and compliance side, that's where we also see growth and opportunities because, and that's kind of like the hammer versus the, I guess, the carrot or the incentive. So that's kind of how we've seen development over time. Now we're focusing, for example, on Australia because of a lot of the development there with government regulation as well.
Thank you, Helena. And thanks for bringing up even about South Africa, because that is the only country right now that we're aware of that has targeted goals for corporations to spend dollars in the supply chains with Black-owned businesses. It's the BBBEE, or the Black Broad-Based Economic Empowerment Program. And for those of you that are not aware, that if you are a corporation doing business in South Africa and you want to do business with other corporations, you have to have a score based on a number of factors. And we have some information on our website, but happy to address that later in the conversation. There are other countries that are looking at this. We learned just a few weeks ago that Kenya has a 30% goal that they're imposing on just the government spending with women-owned businesses. But more and more, I think we'll see additional activity going on around the world. Lee, can you maybe share in terms of enterprise, the business case, and expanding beyond the U.S.?
Certainly. I would tell you that we are rapidly expanding our global footprint. As a company that started back in 57, it was kind of a slow growth in the U.S. and not many people knew who we were, but things have really begun to move exponentially, particularly in view of the fact that we have begun to franchise the enterprise name in the EMEA and the LAC and various other places. So when we talk about expanding our operation, we want to be consistent across all of our operations. We have a set of founding values that our founder came up with, essentially, that really guides and directs who we are. And supplier diversity and diversity and inclusion is certainly part of those values. And so as we expand, we want to ensure that those things are reflected in the way that we do business wherever we do business. Along with that, we want to meet the expectations of our employees and our business partners. One of the reasons that we're expanding and franchising really for the first time in our existence is because our customers basically demanded it of us. We want to do business with you, and we do business with you in the United States, but we are also in a variety of different countries, and we'd like to do business with you there as well. So that is what's driving the expansion, but it's things like our founding values that drive who we are and what we stand for, and making sure that it's consistent across all of our platforms. Very concerned about being about corporate responsibility and citizenship. We're a very community-based company, so we want to make sure that we drive the economic engine of the community that we serve. And so everything that we've tried to do in our supply diversity program is absolutely consistent with who we are as an overall organization.
Great, thank you, Lee. And Peter, can you give us, please, the Accenture's perspective?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Michael. So Accenture is a truly global business. So we have offices in 55 countries, 200 cities, active, supporting our clients in 120 countries. So that means that we have really a global supply chain where we want to make sure that we bring in the best suppliers, the most innovative suppliers for opportunities for ourselves and for our clients. So it makes truly sense for us to have a supply inclusion diversity program that is global, because that way we could really tap from these kind of sources and finding the innovative supplies that we otherwise would not have on our radar. So that's a big part for our business case. Besides, of course, the legislation and the other compliance that we have to meet. So also, this is also part, because we are a global company, our CPO is in Germany, our previous CEO was in France. So, it makes really sense that we have these in the countries where we have our other leadership people and our other communities active. So that is primarily for us the business case, and we also see our supplier inclusion and diversity program being part of our general inclusion and diversity program. It really ties in with our corporate citizenship values. Our development program ties really well in with our skills to succeed ambitions that we have. So we really see our supplier diversity program as part of our really global inclusive DNA. That makes sense.
Great, thank you, Peter. And just one point to add, in doing some research for our white paper that we have also published and have on our website, we learned that, there's a shortage of professional talent, and millennials especially want to work with companies that are doing great jobs in terms of the environment and sustainability and diversity and inclusion. So this is also a bottom line impact in terms of attracting and retaining talent. It's hard to put a number on that, what that actually represents, but it's another dimension I think that we also need to look at. In terms of obstacles and challenges in expanding, Peter, could we start with you? Can you maybe share some of the challenges you went through as you look to go into new markets and go beyond just the U.S. footprint?
Yes. So one of the the challenge for me is always is time, right? This doesn't happen overnight. You really need to build this. You need to have. Yeah, we always say in Holland, you really have to have a long breath. You have to really take a long shot in building a really sustainable program, global supply diversity program, because especially when there's no incentive, no legal incentive, no business incentive, you really need to engage people and make sure that people get it and work with the people who get it and create best practices. That takes some time. So that's a major challenge for us, is to make sure that over a long time period we can build and create a successful program. And that's why for us it's important also to get our leadership engaged, and that's where we start. Once your leadership is engaged and top bottom, they share their vision around supply diversity, that they think this is important and that we should be integrated in the way we source. That can help bring in the others. But it does take time. So I think that for us that's always a major challenge. Also, the other obstacle that you have, once you have people engaged, people come and go. So you always have to make sure that this is sustainable, that you make it also part of your policy and your sourcing process, because if you have an engaged person and the firm, you have to start all over again. So that's another one that we have to overcome. So I guess these are the few things that we have that I see as a challenge, but I think there's an opportunity to make really an integrated part of how we procure.
Thank you, Peter. And Lee, for enterprise, and just to underscore, you're a one-person show. Companies have either a part-time person doing supplier diversity up to maybe 9 or 10 people on their teams. So did you have any unique challenges or obstacles that you've identified within your organization in terms of expanding, and how did you do it?
Well, Enterprise is a vastly decentralized organization. The way that we grew organically from the very beginning was an entrepreneurial model, and the idea was to hire talented people, give them the best customer service training available, and allow them to run their business and be responsible for their own P&L. What that ends up doing is allowing folks who are given those responsibilities the opportunity to make purchasing decisions for their business. And so we have lots of what we would call operating groups all over the world, and each of them have a decision-making capacity. At our world headquarters, there's a decision-making capacity as well. So as we have a bit tighter control in the U.S., we still do not have a central purchasing architecture. We have no CPO in our organization. So the way that it's sort of structured is a challenge in and of itself. So, of course, when you expand outside of the United States, that becomes that much more challenging. A lot of it has to do with communication. Who is the right person to talk to introduce them to the concept of supplier diversity? Who's the right person to talk to take responsibility for driving the initiative locally? Of course, they're only going to give me so many frequent flyer miles. So I have to depend on folks in various other parts of the organization in order to execute our tactics and our strategies. One of the folks who I hope is on the phone call right now is a lady by the name of Vanessa Moore, and she's our supply chain management director in the United Kingdom. And so I would work with her, for instance, as someone that we can collaborate and talk and drive the Supply Diversity Initiative, to be active with WEConnect International in the UK, and to basically sort of spread the gospel of supplier diversity amongst the leaders and her colleagues there. And so as we collaborate, then we can make sure that we're constantly moving the initiative forward. So those are some of the kinds of obstacles and challenges that we have had. And one last thing that I would share with you is just creating what I call a campaign of awareness and careness, right? if you, in the normal course of your duties, aren't familiar with what supplier diversity is, we have to make you aware. But of course, becoming aware is not sufficient in and of itself. You have to have a reason to care. So it's up to myself and folks like Vanessa in our network to say, here's why you should care about this. Women-owned businesses supply innovation. They supply cost savings. They are hungry. They're agile. And to be able to kind of tell that story in a way that becomes compelling for those who are responsible for our profit and loss, as well as our costing.
Thank you, Lee. Helena, if you could share Cummins in terms of obstacles and challenges you've experienced.
Okay, thank you. I'll share challenges first, and then solutions that we've used. With respect to challenges, I'll share two. One is the criteria by region. We find that criteria differs by region for what is considered a diverse supplier, and the related certification varies by region for ensuring that the diverse supplier the local criteria, for WEConnect or other trade organizations. And so that's been our challenge as far as having procurement professionals and business leaders know what is diversity, let's say in Europe, in France versus the UK, or in India versus South Africa. So that's been a challenge, so that when we're telling them we want you to include suppliers in the supply chain, then efforts are often measured by who they think is diverse and then who they include in. So that's why for us, our organization WEConnect is so critical, so that when we find women-owned businesses, they can help us apply the certification, and then that helps to build credibility. And I'll share one of the issues with that is our folks will meet people in areas where there isn't a certification or trade organization like WEConnect, and then they have questions about whether or not they really are diverse. And then it becomes a whole discussion about whether this really is a diverse supplier, and we digress and go kind of down a rabbit hole, and it takes away from kind of our mission. So that's why I share that as a first challenge, is really one, education on what the criteria is for diversity by each region, and then also certification. And then the next challenge we have is availability. Primarily, we're a manufacturing and technology company, but with manufacturing, we have a lot of opportunity in that area, but it's so costly to get into that business. We struggle with finding manufacturing companies. And so even once we educate them, they're certified, often we can't find women-owned businesses, for example, that can meet the needs we have as a manufacturing company. So that has posed challenges for us. As far as solutions, what we've done is we do a lot of education. So, for example, in Africa, we have, when you enter into the purchasing organization, you're required to take an online continuing education course about diversity and about what a diverse supplier is in government regulations. So that was one way for us to really track that people are getting the education they need to support their goals with respect to diversity. In addition, we've done town halls, and we found there with the town halls, once we're in person talking about it, people talk about really total cost of ownership and what the criteria are for a company in purchasing in general. And that's where we've had people share. It just really kind of starts a conversation where people have shared their experiences with diverse suppliers and great stories about how it relates back to the metrics of what all suppliers need to achieve. So that's where we get the conversation going, they learn from each other. And then the final solution I'll just share, since I said I'd share two, the final is really talking points for senior leaders. We find out, we work with our communication, our marketing communications people that write speeches and write the, really essentially the points that different leaders share with the regions around the world. And we find it really effective. So, for example, if our president or chairman is in China, and one of the things he says is, oh, we just worked with this women-owned business, diverse supplier. Oh my gosh, they're doing great. And they can name the company and name really and talk about the importance. Just mentioning it in his speech, people pay attention, and the takeaway is they hear that senior leaders care. So that's kind of two examples of what we've done to solve some of the problems we faced. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, I'm sorry, we had a little technical difficulty on our side. Helena, did you finish?
I did, yeah.
You did a great job, Michael. You would have loved it.
I'm sorry. Javed?
Hi, yes. So I would say from a challenging perspective, some of the things that have already been discussed, and that is really just making sure there's an awareness, right? That people understand what diversity and or inclusion actually means locally. I hear a little bit of background, so maybe if someone would mute if they're on the cell phone. So I think some of the challenges making sure that globally, that a region understands when we're talking about inclusion, that again, it really is purpose driven, that we're focused on region and country specific opportunities. The other thing I think the challenge goes back to what Helena just talked about, making sure that one, you are able to find, women, when we're talking about women-owned businesses of size, scale, and scope, or any suppliers. But also the other part is making sure that we actually have the opportunity from a pipeline development perspective. And so our challenge has been somewhat of both, right? We want to be able to include diverse suppliers and opportunities, but we also have to make sure we have the right suppliers of size, scale, and scope to be able to fit. And when you're trying to create new opportunities, but at the same time be focused on capacity building, but at the same time, when you have a numbers-driven any organization is somewhat numbers driven, you kind of, run into a little bit of a challenge there. And just reminding people that when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, that it really is about creating opportunity, building capacity. And that's when I like to go to the sustainable development goals. And I found that has been somewhat of a help over this past year to make people understand that supplier diversity from a U.S. perspective has, yes, gotten very focused on what are the numbers, what's tier 1, what's tier 2. But I think we have the opportunity when we're talking about global inclusion to actually go back again and take a look at reduction of inequalities, looking at gender equality, looking at, decent work and labor opportunities. And that then allows us to be very, mission specific about what we're looking to do, the kinds of suppliers that we're being able to engage, and then separating truly spend and opportunity, capacity building and opportunity, and then training and awareness. So that's kind of how I tried to take our mission forward, but again, still challenging because of one, not always the opportunity, but then onboarding as well, right? Onboarding can take some amount of time to get suppliers ready to do business with a corporation. So that's the other piece that we're having to take a look at, like really how long should it take for someone to be onboarded? And at the same time, making sure though, that they are in fact certified, that they can in fact do business with you. And then that if you're going to onboard them, is it a sustainable business? So some of those things are business specific that don't necessarily have anything to do with whether or not someone is diverse as much as it does their ability to be capable of being a long-term strategic supplier. So those are some of our challenges plus some of the benefits. I really have been advocating the the sustainable development goals or the global goals, because as we go global, that then makes us all a little more specific and intentional, and even ideally as corporations, collaborative in trying to meet some of the goals and objectives of the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Javette. And, this whole supplier diversity and inclusion concept is still new in most of the markets around the world. So I've heard this recommended several times, is that when you're looking to go beyond the U.S., at least pick a country where there's at least one certifying organization already established, whether it's, WEConnect International, NMSDC Global, or NGLCC Global, so they can help support you and do education and training on the ground, and ideally where you have all three located would be the best. So moving on, Javette, if you could help us understand too, what are some of the unique differences between U.S. and international efforts?
Yeah, and some of the differences I think between U.S. and international efforts is, one, taking a look at what the country laws are in terms of looking at diversity and the amount of information that you can actually obtain, right, in terms of what questions you can or cannot ask. In the U.S., since diversity or supplier diversity as a concept or a mission has been around over 40 years, it's not necessarily an issue to ask, whether someone is ethnic minority, woman-owned, LGBTQ, veteran, etc. But when we go global, we have to think about and be very intentional and specific from a legal perspective to make sure that when we ask certain questions, that we're not violating any privacy rights, that we are not being discriminatory if we allegedly seem like we're looking at one diverse group versus another, and or that we're not leaving out one group versus the other. So that has been one of the things I found to be a little bit different, U.S. to, to global. The other thing, and going back to probably what both Peter and Lee said, it really is the awareness. In many places, people have not felt that they needed to be cognizant of inclusion, what someone might consider a special program or a process. So now to, say that we're going global and we feel like someone needs some specific thought process, some people are a little taken aback by that. So really now having to take a step back myself and even our team to take a look at when we're talking to our global colleagues, understanding what they think about inclusion, what do they think is important? How is it that they see the region and what it needs, or the country and what it needs when it comes to talking about inclusion? What does it mean for them? And then from a sustainability perspective, having them think about, let's just say as an example, in Costa Rica, we've asked them to focus the past year. You had a volcano, there was an earthquake, you had hurricanes, you've had all kinds of things. So think about those things from a sustainability perspective. Think about them from a business risk and continuity perspective. How do you contemplate those things? How does sustainability fit into the process? How do the suppliers that we choose to engage with fit into the process? So we just had to think about a different way of being intentional. The other thing that we've asked is just to make sure that if people feel more comfortable, even if it's a webinar that I am on, I'm trying to ask them to focus on their own webinars and speak in Spanish or Portuguese. If that's the thing that will make others in the area feel that it's a program of ownership for them and it makes more sense, then those are just some of the differences we've asked people to be focused on. Purpose-driven and understanding that our program should be certainly about creating opportunity, training, mentoring, and development, but it has to be very mission-specific in terms of the country or the region in which we're doing business in, whether that's South Africa, Sao Paulo, Costa Rica, Mexico, India, or Singapore. And then finally, just strategic sourcing, making sure that our sourcing managers understand, very similar to when the U.S. did start with the Supplier Diversity Initiative, that in some instances we definitely are going to be looking at small businesses or small medium enterprises versus what we might in the United States consider more of your Category 3 and Category 4 suppliers, which are typically 50 million and beyond. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Javette. Helena, if you could maybe share the challenges or differences between U.S. and non-U.S. efforts.
Sure, thanks, Michael. Javette covered a lot of really good, great points. I can add in two different areas. One is related to the entitlement analysis. So for us, over time, we've developed from setting targets based on just a flat target for all diverse suppliers in the US and abroad to targets based on what's available. And so basically that analysis is, let's say there's a universe of 100 qualified non-diverse suppliers, but we know in a certain category, like let's say loan staff, staffing services, there are, loan staff suppliers are ubiquitous in the US and abroad. So our goal then is to say, okay, for that category, we set an entitlement for diverse suppliers to be, let's say, 80% versus 20. In the US, this has been a journey to even come up with this analysis, and we're still working on it. It's still a work in progress. So when we look at setting targets and incentivizing organizations by region for having targets that are reasonable, it's a lot less structured. And we find it difficult to say, not only do we want you to include diverse suppliers because it's the right thing to do and because it's great for our supply chain, and that's where we kind of fall short, but there's X amount of diverse suppliers available to you. For your target, let's say for loan staff in Mexico, it's a little bit more difficult to say you should have 40% of your category for loan staff services or staffing services to be women-owned businesses, because we just don't always have that data. So I'd say that's the biggest challenge, and it's a journey we've been on now for probably over 2 years, and trying to convert from just kind of general goals, get as many as you can, to or a 12% standard based on some industry data, to standards that are tailored to each region and each region's availability of types of suppliers per category. So that's kind of the journey we're on, and there's certainly difficulties in the US and different regions that we're trying to really figure out, and we're all pitching in and working on it together. I'd say the other area that's a little bit different between the US and abroad, and this isn't a fine line, because we have many companies that we work with that are tier ones that develop tier twos that are transnational, that work in many countries. So one of the differences, though, in the US, it's a little bit easier to get our tier one suppliers to collaborate and develop and work with our tier twos. So we build that pipeline. And it's easy also, I'd say, or easier, relatively feasible for those companies that work in multiple countries to adopt the same approach of supplier development. For countries that we work with, a tier one that doesn't have a presence in the US, it's a little bit more challenging to get them to understand and actually meet our expectations with respect to developing tier 2, 3, and and other types of suppliers to build them up for future pipeline. So those are, I'd say, 2 examples of areas where there's a lot of differences by country, and certainly the US versus other countries.
Thank you, Helena. And Lee Lewis, if you could also share enterprise perspective. Lee, you still there?
Sorry, I was on mute there. My colleagues have done such a wonderful job in sort of answering this question. I'll be brief. But in contemplating for enterprise what the unique differences are between the U.S. and international efforts, the definition of diversity, which has previously been alluded to by Helena, is big. I think the idea that different folks think that diversity means different things. Obviously, women-owned businesses are women-owned businesses, but surprisingly, as we were working with one of our suppliers of information, a business that had a female senior executive was categorized by them as female ownership, when our threshold is 51% ownership by a female or some other diverse leadership. So just understanding what those differences are and being able to apply them to the standards that you've set for your program and for your initiative. I think the availability of diverse-owned businesses is obviously a bit different in the U.S. than it is internationally. Of course, there are many, many people of many, many stripes who are available to do business with, but it doesn't seem as prevalent and as easy to get to as it is in the U.S. And so that's why our relationship with WEConnect International is so important, because you do a great job of putting us in touch with women-owned businesses wherever it is that we operate. I talked a little bit about information. Obviously, it's difficult for you to understand where you are going to go and how you're going to get there if you don't know where you are. So spend tracking is important to us. And the information about who's diverse and some of the definition things that I've already talked about are not as readily prevalent outside the country as it is here in the U.S., at least not for us. And so what ends up happening is that our folks end up having to manually track these things in the best way that they possibly can based on what they're able to determine. And then that gets into some of the things that Javette talked about with regard to asking those questions. Are you diverse? And then explaining what that means, or are you woman-owned or what have you, and what that threshold is, are you going to get yourself into any kind of legal situations? We didn't have a legal situation per se, but when we started asking those questions in Quebec, for instance, we got a lot of pushback. People weren't comfortable with those questions being asked, and so we had to then rely on our folks in Canada with Chelsea and our friends over at CAMSI to help us out with some of the language that we needed to utilize in order to have those conversations. So, and obviously, there are many things that drive the initiative here in the U.S., one of which is our external stakeholders and business partners. It's important to them here in the U.S. That importance is not as robust outside the U.S., so there's a driver that is not as strong in that market. So again, just sort of examining the differences between our programs domestically and internationally, those are some of the things that I look at regularly. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. And then Peter, since you're the one that's based outside of the U.S., it'd be great to get your perspective on the difference between the U.S. and international programs.
Yes, well, I think most of the points have already been mentioned. So thanks everyone for that. So what I see is, well, of course, the maturity level. Every time when I go to a conference in the US, I'm always overwhelmed how big it is and how do you say that, normal it is over there. Well, here, for instance, here in the Netherlands, I constantly have to explain, especially also to women-owned businesses, why should they identify themselves as women-owned business? Because they say, well, I don't want to identify myself as a women-owned business because I don't want to be successful because I'm a woman. I want to be successful because I'm a good business. And that is a difference, that it's not as clear-cut, and people over here, and I also see that in other countries, especially in Europe, they're not super convinced why this is important, why this should be a key factor when doing business with us as a corporation. So I think that's a difference. It still needs to have a lot of explanation over here. Also, what I see is that, what I noticed when growing our program outside the US is that you really have to look at the market, at the cultures in the different countries. Here in Europe alone, in the European Union, we have 28 countries with different cultures and different opportunities and different focus points as well, not just from a legal standpoint, but just also from a society standpoint. If you look at France, for instance, there's a strong focus on the Paris banlieues, right? The government wants to include more people that come from certain neighborhoods in the cities. So that means that we have to really look at that and also include other diversity areas, but really have to focus on that, because that's what people locally think it's important. In Germany and the Netherlands, for instance, we really look at refugees. How can we help the refugees that came to our countries, also those who are able to become an entrepreneur or already are an entrepreneur, to help them to become successful and contribute to society. So that means also for our program that has that kind of focus. So these are, I think, the differences between the markets over here. So it's not just difference for me between US and other markets, but it's differences between the other markets themselves as well. And that makes it another challenge, but it also makes it exciting, because it really means that you have to steer and really focus in the different countries on different things, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. It's always good to get an outside US perspective. So we're going to just do a time check here. We have about 15 minutes left, so we're going to leave about 10 minutes for Q&A for the audience. So I just have just ask the panel to just keep your remarks brief, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So, Javed, if we could start with you, what steps can supplier diversity and inclusion professionals take to get internal support and resources within the organization?
Thanks, Michael, for that question. One of the things I found to be helpful the past couple of years is aligning with your corporate affairs team or your global government affairs. When you have that additional local support, I think is extremely helpful, particularly if your program is based in procurement. Of course, procurement, I think, is the best place for me, right? Because we're making most of the decisions regarding supplier utilization. But because it is new in different countries, having those additional people who can communicate, who are up to speed with local government concerns and considerations, community engagement, et cetera. It's really a great partnership to have. So I would say my suggestion would be definitely align with corporate affairs and global affairs, and where applicable, a sustainability team or green team, as it may be called.
Great, thank you, Javette. Helena.
Hi. So as far as steps to take, I would start by getting to know who the leads are for the ERGs in the different regions where you'd like to have a program. And again, this is to supplement what Javette already said, because I agree with 100% with what she said. But to add on to it, I would also connect with the ERGs, employee resource groups in the different regions where you want to develop, because that groundswell of support and leadership will really help. They're great partners. And then the other place I'd look is your customers. In this community, we have access to our customers, all of us do, and where our customers care about diversity and inclusion in different regions, it matters. And often our customers asking the question and making it clear that they care and sharing that information also helps to give really good feedback to leadership organizations, either where you're headquartered or in the remote regions where you want to have a program, so that they know that it does matter. It matters to the employees and it matters to our customers. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Helena. Lee Lewis.
In the interest of time, I don't have anything to add to what the two ladies have said. I'd go 100% with what they said.
Okay, thank you, Lee. And Peter.
So for us, what was important is to make sure that we get our leadership buy-in. Like I said earlier, I think make sure that they are convinced that this is important for Accenture, for procurement. Also, like the others said, get other groups within your company and see what is the local objective, what are the local ambitions, and how can we integrate our supplier diversity program into that. Like I said in the previous question, because there sometimes are different objectives per country, make sure that our program caters to that and helps to support that, so that you have a common point to collaborate with each other, and that can also help to convince them to work with you with your ambitions.
Yeah, Michael, if I could, just one more thing to Peter Bate, when you said leadership, that part is critical when you're going global, because they're different. For us, as an example, they're country managers. So you want to make sure that you are aligned with that local leadership, not just a local sourcing person or supply chain leader, and even those that I mentioned before, the country leader, that needs to be something that is of interest to him or her and a part of their own metrics. In order for it to also be successful, so that they too are held accountable for moving a program forward.
Definitely, and I think for us, I think it's very fortunate that our CPO is based in Germany, because sometimes I did get always the remark, oh yeah, supplier diversity, that's an American thing, it's not for here. But the fact that we have a CPO now in Germany who's really bought into this and very passionate about it, that helps with convincing people in other countries as well.
Thank you.
Makes it a more global program.
Absolutely. And one last question, and just ask each of you to just give a quick response. What do you wish someone would have told you when you were starting out on the global journey? If there's one nugget that you can share with the audience. So, Javette?
I had to actually think about that. One thing that I would have known, that I would have wanted to have known. Wow, onboarding. That contemplated that onboarding is not as easy as I thought it would be. I thought it would be as simple as develop the line of sight, find the supplier that's it, fit the supplier in. And onboarding requires some additional consideration. So I would have taken more time to really study it in advance. By country, or find just a different way to get suppliers onboarded, in addition to trying to identify them via WEConnect and the other organizations.
Thank you. Helena?
Mm-hmm.
For me, I'd share that when I took on this role now 2 years ago, I guess I thought it would be easy. diversity isn't new, and the idea that you need different types of suppliers in order to be successful. You can't hire the same, same type of supplier with the same solutions and the same products and services, like 10 of the same suppliers, in order to be competitive and be able to have a company that thrives. So to me, it was really, really obvious. And so I think I struggled with why do companies need a separate organization to reinforce a message that everyone seems to embrace? So for me, I'd say what people would have told me was what their challenges were in delivering on this value that is a value of our company and many others. And so I wish I would have listened more and used my relationships more early on to understand what the challenges were. Because at the beginning, there's a corporate objective, there's a value, there's strategic plans, it's in everybody's performance metrics. So I think I started out with just more of an analytical approach to driving results. And I wish I would have, somebody had pulled me aside to say, just have informal discussions and find out what's really the roadblock for this becoming part of just how every company and how Cummins does business. And so I think it's taken time for me to have really those issues that have come up to understand and have people frankly tell me what the challenges are. So I'd say I wish people would have said, just go to coffee more, spend more time going to coffee with people in the different regions and in purchasing in the business to understand what they really think about the challenges. So I can work on, so that the analytical strategy is partnered with kind of like a practical strategy. I think we've all heard culture eats strategy for lunch. And it's that kind of a feeling, tapping into the culture to understand what the roadblocks are versus just the strategy.
Great, thank you, Helena. Lee Lewis.
Yes, sir. I think that for me, just the complexity that's associated with applying a supply diversity initiative outside the country was something that I would like to have been better prepared for. I think you make a lot of assumptions if you're coming into the space about what diversity is, what supplier diversity is, and how people feel about it. But when you leave the borders of the United States, things change dramatically and rapidly. So things along the lines of the information that's available about the universe of diverse businesses out there, women-owned businesses, the government involvement, stakeholder interest, the careness and awareness of our operators. We ask them to do a lot of things and trying to get them involved in this conversation and talk about how important it is was a challenge, and certainly the definitions of different things. So, yeah, just the overall complexity of things was something that I wish that I was better prepared for, but we got it now, and we're working at it.
Great, thank you, Lee. And Peter Zerp.
Yeah, so first of all, that I had to be patient, because that's not what I am, but you really need to spend a long time convincing other people of your passion. Because I can be passionate about diversity, but for others it can be, you have to explain it in a different way. So I really had to learn to, that sometimes you need to talk to people differently and convince them, because they would like to do this for other reasons. So for me, it is about, because I want to create inclusive economies and a more inclusive world. But for others, they would say, yeah, that's all very fine, but what's in it for Accenture? And then I have to explain to them, well, it's also good for Accenture because it brings in innovation in our supply chain, but it's also good because it helps. We can work together with our clients on this, because most of the WEConnect corporate members are also Accenture clients. So it also means that it can strengthen your relationship. And then, people who think about that in that kind of way also get it, but for a different reason. And that's what I really had to learn. It took some time to really, that the quarter dropped, and that I really needed to focus on people, some people in different ways, to get them behind and in my corner.
Great, those are great sharing. So thank you so much for that. So now we're going to go through, we have a few questions that our audience has presented. So I'll just read them off and just ask one of the panelists, if whoever wants to volunteer to take on the question. We have, the first one is, what third-party outsourcing service providers do you use to help measure and monitor the effectiveness of the supplier diversity programs at the global level? So anyone want to offer to respond?
I can respond. This is Helena with Cummins. We do have a third-party vendor. We just switched to this vendor in January. And the prior vendor we used did have a global platform. I'd share what I've seen with the different global vendors and the third-party vendors is that they charge us by seat, essentially by license. So we buy, let's say, $250 to $300 to track reporting, and find that we put more of the resources in the US than abroad, just because it's just not as robust in some regions. And we use the Excel spreadsheets abroad still to track.
Yeah, same thing for us at this point, because while we started to collaborate with someone just in terms of general tracking and data enrichment, but the global piece still does not seem that it's not something any one company has a full grasp on just yet. And especially when we're also trying to do economic impact. So some part of the global piece, we're still having to track ourselves, working with our analytics team internally.
Yeah, the same for here. We do have vendors in the US, and we are looking at to work with them also on a global level. But that's for Accenture. It's also still something that we're doing internally, and we're developing our own methodology for that.
Great, thank you. And just to underscore that, most companies that I work with are still using Excel spreadsheets outside of the US, so it's still it's an opportunity for someone. Okay, our next question is, how do you manage to define diversity designations by country? Did you designations yourself, or are there other resources that you utilized? And how much and how often could you rely on diversity associations like WEConnect or MSD UK versus building your own framework? So maybe I'll
start. This is, if you don't mind, Michael. Yeah, and one of these, and I'll be quick. I think the key thing about trying to rely on a WEConnect and an NMSDC is that at least you have a proven process. So we have organizations that are in existence. It makes me feel a little bit more comfortable. Or if you're connected to the government versus us, a corporation trying to decide what equates to diversity. I think it allows for a certain amount of consistency and then helps to eliminate fraud later on. So my preference and how we've done it thus far is to rely on third-party certifiers such as WEConnect or NMSDC global affiliates.
Thank you. And I just have time for one last question. How did you determine which country to start working with first?
Well, for us, maybe I can answer that one. So for us, one of the things that it's important is our footprint. So, we are in many countries, but, we need to understand, what is our footprint? How big is Accenture there? Do we have a considerable supply chain there so that we have enough opportunities to also match with local diverse businesses? Another one is, we touched on it before, engagement. So do we have resources? Do we have leadership people that are engaged into this? Do we have internal people that we can collaborate with? And also, is there a certifying body that can help us to identify diverse businesses, in this case, women-owned businesses? And that's also the reason why we founded WEConnect International, because they could help us which markets we can start first. And first, that was Canada and the UK, because these are the countries where we have a large footprint and supply chain. And that is how we go on and on and on. The same for Japan last year. The reason why we started in Japan was because we have all those boxes checked in this case.
I would concur with that. Our customers drive where we take our business, and our business drives where we take our supplier diversity initiative. So as our first expansion was into Canada, and then we went over to the UK, and so our supplier diversity program naturally followed that path.
Okay, thank you. And that's about it. I'm sorry, we need to wrap up here. If we didn't get to your question, we'll be sure to reach out to you separately after this. So thank you very much for posing your questions. And I just wanted to end, thank the panel for your help, and just invite everybody that's not registered or attending WeBank to make sure that you know about our International Day event, which happens on June 24th in Baltimore. We'll have an opportunity for you to network with other corporations doing this work, our women businesses from around the globe, as well as a lot of our in-country leads are going to be there as well. So it's a great opportunity to get some experience and exposure to the non-US opportunities. So thank you all very much. We greatly appreciate it, and we'll post this on our website. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.